I think we can now start. So I'm glad to introduce this fourth meeting of the Shelves, which will be the last one for this year. The Shelves is a series of book presentations co-organized by Filosofia Antica Torino and Cambridge University Press. So we have here Giulia De Cesaris and Federico Petrucci for the group Filosofia Antica Torino. Just a couple of remarks before to start. So the meeting will be recorded and the recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. And another thing is that CUP will offer a 40% discount on the book to those attending. And to get the discount, you have to write an email to Michael Sharp, and you find his email address in the chat. So today we will present David Ebrey's volume, Plato's Phaedo, Forms, Death, and the Philosophical Life. So the author will briefly introduce the book, and then Suzanne Obdrzalek and Federico Petrucci will provide some comments. So David Ebrey is Serra Fellow at the University of Barcelona, and his main interests are in Plato's, especially ethics and epistemology, also Aristotle, logic, and natural philosophy especially. Let me just recall his edited volume, Theory, Practice in Aristotle's Natural Science for CUP in 2015, and the recently appeared Cambridge Companion to Plato, co-edited with Richard Kraut for CUP 2022. So please, David.
All right, thanks everyone for showing up. I really appreciate it. Of course, I also really appreciate the work of the commentators and going through the volume and preparing your comments. In some ways, it's a kind of hard volume to quickly and neatly summarize. There isn't a single central thesis that I'm just consistently arguing for across the book. Instead, what drew me to write the book is that I, on the one hand, had a lot of distinct ideas about the Phaedo. And so I wanted to write something, and I didn't want there to be any chapter that I just sort of had to phone in. Like, well, I got to write a chapter on this because it's part of the Phaedo. I had ideas for better or worse on each part of the dialogue. But at the same time, I was interested in trying to show how to pull all of the parts together as a complex organic whole. So this is what drew me to sort of develop these individual ideas, but at the same time try to pull together and show how all of the different parts fit into one another. So a few of the lead ideas in the book, one is to, of course, carefully situate the parts of the dialogue within the larger whole. Another is to try to carefully think about the intellectual background of a lot of the ideas that we find in the Phaedo, and to think about how Plato is responding to those ideas and developing them in the Phaedo. So to give a couple of concrete examples, I argue that Plato is writing the whole dialogue as an alternative to tragedy. And so that's drawing on the existing genre of tragedy, and you need to have some idea of how he thinks about tragedy in order to think about what he's doing there. Another example, I argue that the discussion of causation in the autobiography should be understood against the backdrop of early Greek medicine and the discussion of causes in early Greek medicine. So that's just a couple of examples of how I think that the intellectual background is important, but the important thing is to see how Plato is appropriating and transforming these ideas, making them very much his own. So in the introduction to the book, I sort of run through, part, of course, of what drew me to write the book was the Phaedo includes some of Plato's most famous ideas, and I had new thoughts about the forms and the nature of the soul, contemplative ethical ideal, discussion of causation. So I was drawn to that, but I also think that there's parts of the dialogue that have been unduly ignored, set aside. Maybe ignored is a little strong, but not given proper attention, such as the discussion of mythology or the cosmological account that we get at the end of the dialogue. So my goal was to think about who the characters are, think about the intellectual background, and then try to pull together an overall account of the dialogue, working through the details of the parts and to see how it pulls into a larger whole. So what I thought I would do is briefly give an account of the arc of the dialogue as it looks as I'm reading it. So Socrates is presented as calm and at ease on the last day of his life. He has a conversation with his closest companions, a type of conversation that he wouldn't have had he been discussing with other people. So I think it's very important to think about who he's having this discussion with. Early on, they ask him to defend his view that the philosopher is better wants to be dead. His initial explanation for this, the defense speech, introduces many of the central ideas in the dialogue, but almost all of these ideas are explained in further detail later as part of what I call the unfolding structure of the dialogue. Now, after Socrates presents this defense speech, Cebes raises an objection, a very famous objection, and scholars typically put this objection in terms of wanting to know that the soul is immortal, but this is not how Cebes puts it, nor how Socrates understands it. Cebes specifically wants confidence, pistis, that they shouldn't fear that the soul is dissipated and destroyed upon death. And Socrates' next three arguments, the cyclical, kinship, and recollecting arguments, aim to establish this, and in doing so clarify the nature of forms in the soul. Socrates then uses these theories to clarify his ethical account. So at the midpoint of the dialogue, then, I think two major threats arise, and the second half of the dialogue needs to be understood as responding to these threats. One threat is provided by Simmias and Cebes' objections to the kinship argument, and responding to this requires getting clearer on causation and the nature of the soul. The other threat is of mythology, which would mean that no matter how good of argument Socrates gave in the second half, if they don't respond to the threat of mythology, his companions could become haters of argumentation and give up on philosophy. Socrates' autobiography and his final argument, I think, are meant to address both of these threats. And the cosmology and eschatology at the end of the dialogue draws on his accounts of forms and of ordinary objects to imagine what a worse afterlife would look like, seeing it as the source of all flux, as opposed to the better afterlives that he describes, which are increasingly form-like. Finally, in the death scene, on my view, Socrates is shown exemplifying exactly the ethical views that he's been describing over the course of the dialogue. So there's a sort of brief account of the arc of the dialogue as I see it, and I think what we should do now is let the commentators take over.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for this introduction. So I'll now leave the floor to Federico Petrucci, who is a professor at the University of Torino, and his main area of expertise are Platonism and the history of Plato and the history of Platonism. I recall two of his publications, two monographs, so one of Theon of Smyrna and the other on Taurus of Beirut, the other side of Middle Platonism. So please, Federico.
Thank you, Ariane, and thanks to all those who are connected, and especially to David, who accepted this invitation and gave me the opportunity to comment on this great volume. I mean, this one thing that it is remarkable is that, I mean, I think that it is very hard to write a book on the Phaedo today. I mean, and one must be quite brave to accept this kind of task. Since, I mean, you David, say that the recollecting argument is probably one of the most commented passages in ancient philosophy, but the Phaedo itself is probably one of the most commented writings in ancient philosophy. And I think so that it is a hard task, and David did accomplish a great job, because this book, as he mentioned, is not just focused on some passages or some aspects. It is actually a complete analysis of the Phaedo that, however, has the actual form of a monograph. I mean, it has a specific agenda, it has several views, several tenets. And well, in my discussion, I'll suggest that probably I agree with many of them, I may disagree with some of them, but still the overall interpretation of the dialogue is consistent, effective, very challenging and interesting. So, I mean, these are the general reasons I may be grateful to him for this. And the volume itself follows, in general, the dramatic development of the dialogue. But another interesting thing is that this doesn't depend just on the fact that it is, I mean, relatively obvious that one starts from the beginning of the dialogue, but there is a more specific philosophical point, if I got it correctly, that is that David detects a specific unfolding structure in the arguments. So there are many traces, argumentative and thematic traces within the dialogue. And I think that the subtitle of the volume, Forms, Death, and the Philosophical Life, highlights the three major traces. I mean, you can find unfolding within the dialogue. And so you can follow these lines unfolding by reading chapter after chapter the arguments. And of course, if it seems to me that David wants to reproduce the way in which Plato wanted us to read the dialogue. I mean, progressively understanding what's going on by further development and deepening. And so when one gets to the end of the volume, one has the complete philosophical scenario in front of you have the complete scenario in front of you, and you have the whole philosophical picture displayed. So in this sense, the overall, I mean, structure is quite consistent, and there are many focuses. I mean, in a sense, many sections are commented as they would be in a commentary, with very close textual analysis that perfectly fits the overall argumentative structure of the volume. So Suzanne and I coordinated, so I will comment just on a set of issues, and I frequently ask questions. So my comments will probably be aimed especially at opening the discussion with Suzanne, with David, and with everybody joining the discussion after our planned commentaries. So I will start with the first two chapters that provide the dramatic, that provide an interpretation of the overall dramatic setting. And so you can find in the first chapter interpretations of the profiles, so to speak, of the characters. There are some very interesting things that are said about Simmias and Cebes. For instance, and this is probably the most interesting thing for me in the first two chapters, about their being to some extent close to Pythagoreanism. And the most important thing is to some extent. I mean, what David emphasizes is that there is, of course, some kind of relationship, but the most important thing is how Socrates recovers Pythagoreanism, and on the other hand, rethinks and puts Pythagoreanism within the new framework of his own philosophy. At some point, he speaks of appropriation, and I think this is very effective as a description. I'll get back to this by commenting on the second chapter, just because it's, in my view, quite an important point for Plato in general. I mean, it's an overall philosophical phenomenon one can detect in Plato. And so, for instance, I quote from page 18, chapter 1, Socrates moves smoothly and seamlessly from discussing and reinterpreting Pythagorean views to discussing and reinterpreting other religious views, including those associated with Orpheus and with the Ulyssean mysteries. So all these things, many and important things, converge in the dialogue through its characters. And Socrates is the one who provides an overall philosophical understanding of this. And another interesting thing of this chapter, but I'm saying this also because it is something that is not usual in Anglo-American scholarship, is the fact that Socrates, of course, David emphasizes that in the Phaedo you have a specific Socrates, and in each dialogue you have a specific Socrates, though he stresses the fact that in each dialogue you have a specific attitude, a specific, approach, also depending, of course, on interlocutors. But there is it seems to me at least, quite a strong unitary view of Plato's representation of Socrates. I mean, you may have many attitudes throughout the corpus, but still it is Socrates having different attitudes. He says at page 26, whatever the reasons for this difference, Socrates defends broadly similar views in these dialogues. The best life involves knowledge and virtue is very closely connected to wisdom, perhaps identical to it. And this is the most important thing. These dialogues show different ways in which Socrates' broad commitments can be developed and defended. And this is interesting because, it's I would say, a slightly unitarist reading of Plato that is also sympathetic with many Italian readings of Plato. So in that sense, I feel closer to us, traditional Anglo-American scholarship. And so this is for the first chapter. In the second chapter, you have further discussion of the literary framework. And what I would emphasize, and already David mentioned this, is that the Phaedo is an alternative to tragedy. And this is very important since it is specified. The sense in which we should understand this is specified by David. And he says that alternative must be understood in a much robust sense, in the sense that there is a rejection of tragedy as such, that this new form of tragedy appropriates elements of tragedy, but reframes them in a new philosophical framework. And this framework fits the requirements of Republic 2 and 3. And there is something I very much appreciated. There is Socrates, who is a new tragic hero. And the idea of Plato inventing and depicting the new tragic hero is very interesting to me, and it is the way in which, well, it reflects, in my view, the fact that Plato is consciously not only writing literature or philosophical literature, but that while writing philosophical literature is also producing a sort of implicit literary criticism. And the two things are strictly related to each other. And perhaps, what he does in the Phaedo is, in practice, what he announces in the Aeon, where Socrates just apparently criticizes the rhapsode or the poets, but in fact, what he's doing is still using poetry in order to produce a form of literary criticism. For certain the Phaedo is one of the places in which all this art is put in practice in the clearest way. And on this, I would also emphasize another point. This thing of appropriating literary models is very important in my view, and this happens continuously in the dialogues. What I have in mind, of course, just because it has become an obsession for me, is the Timaeus, in which in that case, of course, it's not tragedy on stage, but it's epic poetry. But the phenomenon is almost the same. It is not just rejecting epic poetry. Overall, it's not just writing something entirely new, is appropriating the languages of epic poetry in order to produce the new epic poetry. And I know that David would agree with this. My feeling is that this is not only a conscious strategy, but also that this is a very bold strategy. I mean, there is a passage in the Timaeus, especially, in which he says about the elements, but the concept is almost the same. No one has ever really understood anything about the elements of how elements work. And the same can be applied also to the correct use of some literary forms. This is the I would say the kind of alternative of this is probably the meaning in which this idea of being alternative to tragedy, epic poetry, and so on would maybe be understood. And on this, well, of course, I'm just spelling out some free thoughts. But on this, I also have a question, since this idea of Socrates being a new hero may lead us, I would think, also to consider him as somebody who knows. This kind of hero, in my view, is characterized by many things that David indicates, for instance, being morally extraordinary, or being closer to the divine as a philosopher, and so on. But perhaps knowledge, in my view, might also characterize this kind of person. While, if I have it right, you, David, wouldn't agree with this. I mean, or just to some extent. And this is one of the questions I would ask. I mean, to what extent is Socrates characterized by being extraordinary from a moral point of view, in as much as is extraordinary also from an epistemological point of view, a cognitive point of view? So I'll skip now some chapters, also because, of course, Suzanne will deal with them as well. I have a couple of questions probably on chapter 3, but I'll just skip this part and perhaps we can get back to them in the discussion. And I will just skip to the cyclical argument. This is chapter 5, the recollecting argument. And this is the passage about which David said this is probably one of the most commented sections, and it is indeed. So I will not, systematically review this chapter that is very rich. There are two very rich chapters, especially this one and chapter 9 are really deep and systematic. What I would like to highlight here is that David emphasizes the progressiveness of the argument. So he detects all steps in the argument, and he also emphasizes the fact that the process itself is progressive. And this is the reason why, and I would entirely agree with him, he calls the argument the recollecting argument, right? Or not the recollection argument. This leads, in my view, to another question I would ask. And the question is related to the role of belief as a cognitive state in this process. I mean, there's a passage that you mentioned in a footnote from the Meno, but that is, in my view, quite telling of what Plato has in mind, at least in the Meno, about recollection. And at the end of the experiment with the slave, at 85c, he says, well, if someone will Pollakis and Pollake ask questions to this person, eventually, perhaps, he will get knowledge. So I think that this testifies to the progression involved in the process, and I agree with this. The point is that throughout the whole process, you just have beliefs in that specific case of the Meno. And perhaps you will reach some kind of knowledge. Is this the case also in the Phaedo in your view, or is there any point at which you reach knowledge of this and not from something else? And so in that case, how would you just describe the role of the interaction between belief and knowledge in this process? And so this is the question. And on the other hand, another remarkable thing of this chapter is that David carefully provides an account of what forms and objects, ordinary things, are out of epistemological arguments. And this is a recurring feature of the volume that is very well developed also in this sense. So, for instance, in this chapter, he explains that you can draw from the recollecting argument the fact that there is a specific difference between forms and ordinary things, and that the difference is the fact that ordinary things change through time, while forms are characterized by the fact that they don't change. I think this is very insightful and consistent with your argument. A question would be, and I'll get back to this later on, what would you mean by ordinary things? I mean, what's the ontology of these ordinary things? You provide many aspects of these things. For instance, here, the fact that they change, and I would entirely agree with you. It is not entirely clear to me whether you would subscribe to a bundle theory or a more hylomorphic view of sensible particulars. And the reason why I'm asking is that in that case, if you opt for a sort of hylomorphic reading, you can really say, look, I'm looking at this thing and I'm grasping the main form involved. While if you go for the bundle theory, then it's more complicated, just because you should just select properties of the thing, and you're not really recollecting that thing. This is, of course, a sort of, never-ending question, especially in recent scholarship on Plato. And I think one may guess the reading you would incline, but perhaps that might be interesting to have a look into these more in the debate. So we are going towards ontology, metaphysics, broadly speaking. I skip chapters 6 to 8, and I'll focus on chapter 9. So that is devoted to Socrates' autobiography. And this is a really intriguing and massive discussion of what's going on. I will just focus first on the issue of Anaxagoras' nous and what's the role of this nous in the Phaedo. There are, of course, many interesting things I cannot focus on here. For instance, David referred to the role of ancient medicine, well, pre-Platonic medicine in this section, and I think this is insightful, since David is able to shed light on the use and meaning of key terms, ition, itia, and so on, and I think that the reference to medicine is very effective in this sense and can actually lead us to understand more than we did before on this issue. But so, if I have it right, David's view on this Anaxagoras passage is that Socrates is not really is not necessarily looking for a cause that is good. I mean, it is not necessary for Plato that a cause is good as such. It may be, and in that case, of course, on the nous it is, but it's not necessary for a cause to be good. I think that this is very insightful and very important for an overall reading of Plato. May explain some, controversial passages also in our dialogues. For instance, when in Timaeus, at some point, the demiurge is said to be the best of the causes. And of course, that is puzzling. Well, for a sempiternalist reader, this is not puzzling, since they may say, look, there is no demiurge. Demiurge is just a metaphor for forms. So that means that forms and the demiurge are the best causes. Well, a temporalist reader would be taught with this, but you can apply a sort of restrictive reading of cause in that case, so sort of good cause. And so if you have a clear idea that a cause may not be good to some extent, you can also have a more restrictive reading of some passages referring to causes. On the other hand, another thing that David stresses is that teleology is not as central in that passage. I mean, there's not a full account of teleology hidden in that passage. Just because you have, of course, a cause and an end, but you don't have an explicit, complete idea of many things that would be required for a full account of teleology to be there. For instance, there is no specific indication of how specific things work, what are the things working in this order, and why so. Also in this case, I would agree, even though I wonder to what extent the dialogical context has an impact on this. I mean, probably Socrates is not interested here in providing an account, so he's just leaving the details aside in order to go ahead to the second sailing. So, I mean, the fact that there are no specific aspects of teleology probably doesn't imply that he doesn't want teleology to be there in a more general perspective. And then a last remark on the notion of cause, since in this chapter, of course, David deals also with the role of forms as causes. And here, well, we already had a conversation on this in Athens, probably. Also because a recent book by Vasilis Politis has, challenged again some views. And so if I have it right, David's point is that causes, that forms are, of course, causes. And I will read a passage from page 211 that summarizes the point. According to Socrates' own view, the idea of X being F is that X has a share in the form of Fness. The form of Fness seems to be what is responsible. The idea describes how this form is responsible for things being beautiful, by the things having a share of the form. So there's a very interesting distinction between the sharing in the form and the form itself. And I would agree with this. And apparently, the form is a cause in a stronger sense. It is an object or a metaphysical object. But in that case, it's a cause. But on the other hand, sometimes David gets back to the explanatory power of forms. And For instance, later on in the chapter, you get back exactly to the lexicon of explanation. Forms explain are causes in as much as they explain properties of a thing. So my question is still the same from Vlastos onwards. I mean, what's your precise account of this? And why, in your view, if I have it right, all this doesn't imply, well, why, in your view, the fact that forms are causes or are responsible for doesn't imply their separation? And my point would be this one. Your analysis would naturally lead to separation. If you say, if one says that forms are different from sensible particulars since they not change, so they are stable, they are simple, of course they are not perceptible, they are not tridimensional. If they are all of these things, if they have all these features, well, perhaps he doesn't say they are separated, but then you need a sort of intermediate ontological realm between sensible particulars and what separated forms would be if there were separated forms. And this is, so I would say they must be separated, even though that produces other problems. But still, what would be your last word on this? The book, of course, doesn't end here. You'd have chapters also on CB's objection and the final argument, with a very careful analysis of this, and then the final myth and the cosmos in the afterlife, and then that scene. But I'll stop here and leave the floor to Suzanne.
So thank you, Federico, for these stimulating comments. I'll now leave the floor to Suzanne, who is a professor at Claremont McKenna College. She has extensively worked on Plato and especially on ethics, and also on skepticism. I recall two publications, Contemplation and Self-Mastery in Plato's Phaedo, and Moral Transformation and the Love of Beauty in Plato's Symposium. So please, Suzanne.
Oh, thank you so much, and to David and everyone. And it's so nice to see so many friends' faces. David's book is awesome. Go buy it and read it. That's all I've got to say to it. Well, actually, I'm going to add a few more words. David's book is wonderful. I am enormously impressed by its clarity, rigor, creativity, and intellectual honesty. In terms of methodology, David is committed to understanding the Phaedo in its own terms. This means that on the one hand, he is hesitant to interpret the dialogue in terms of other works by Plato, which might, after all, represent different strands in Plato's thought. And on the other hand, it means that he does not focus on individual passages within the dialogue in isolation, but instead seeks to understand them in relation to the dialogue as a whole. David takes the dialogue to have an unfolding structure. On his interpretation, claims that Socrates' advances early in the dialogue are often only fully explained and defended later. This interpretive strategy enables David to take seriously passages that are often dismissed as merely metaphorical or mythical. David's book aims to give a complete interpretation of the dialogue, and his topics range from the Phaedo as an alternative to tragedy to the meaning of the claim that the forms are auta kathauta. His main themes are the nature of the forms, the soul, and the good life. There is obviously a lot to talk about in this book, but I'm going to restrict my comments to some topics relating to the nature of the forms, the soul, and the body, as these arise in David's discussion of the defense, the kinship argument, the return to the defense, and the response to the harmonia argument. The first topic I want to address is David's treatment of the preposition kata and the related expressions auto kathauta and katatauta ehe. David's discussion of kata is one of the centerpieces of his book. It reflects careful philological research and advances a new and important interpretation of a central topic in Plato's metaphysics. David first broaches this topic in his discussion of the defense. In the defense, Socrates claims that the philosopher is better off dead because only when he is dead will his soul be sufficiently purified to exist aute kathautein and to gain wisdom. Auto kathauto is often translated as itself by itself, where this means itself separate from other things. David rejects this interpretation. He surveys the use of auto kathauto by Plato's predecessors and argues that it means on its own in the sense of without outside help. David also observes that at 79d, Socrates claims that when the soul becomes aute kathautein, it comes to be with meta, the forms. Given that when the soul is aute kathautein, it is with the forms, we cannot simply take auto kathauto to mean itself by itself, all alone. Instead, David proposes that we should take auto kathauto to mean roughly without outside assistance or interference, i.e. what the soul does aute kathautein is what it does on its own without the interference of the body. According to David, the soul's being aute kathautein is connected to its being pure and unmixed, because only when the soul is pure and unmixed does it do all of its activities through itself and without outside interference. One question I have for David is if he could elaborate on the relation between being separate, being pure, and being auto kathauto. David claims that when the soul is with the body, it is impure and hence not aute kathautein, but when it is with the forms, it is pure and hence aute kathautein. I would be interested to know what exactly purity versus impurity means in this context. It is obviously not the same as not being with anything, since when the soul is pure, it is with the forms. But David also treats being pure as distinct from being auto kathauto. The soul's being pure is what ensures that it can engage in all its activities without outside interference and hence be aute kathautein. But then what exactly does purity mean, such that the soul is pure when it is with the forms, but impure when it is with the body? David provides a related discussion of the phrase kata tauta eche in his discussion of the kinship argument. In the kinship argument, Socrates singles out a class of things which he refers to as the unseen. These things always hold, eche, kata tauta. As a result, they are likely to be incomposite and indestructible. The forms are presented as the paradigmatic members of this class. But what does it mean to say that the forms hold kata tauta? And why does Socrates connect the fact that particulars fail to hold kata tauta to their being composite and hence destructible? David once again engages in careful philological research. According to David, the kata relation should be distinguished from the pros relation. For example, Simmias is large pros compared to Socrates, kata, in relation to his height. Whereas pros posits a relationship between a given thing and something external to it, kata picks out, quote, something related to the internal structure of the subject that determines some manner in which a predicate applies to it. Thus, when Socrates claims that sense particulars do not hold kata tauta, what he means is that they do not possess their features or engage in their activities through the same structural features of themselves. For example, a horse might be beautiful kata its mane, but not kata its hooves. Why does David specify that kata posits a relationship between something and a structural feature of itself? Because this enables him to explain why the fact that sense particulars never hold kata tauta is related to their being composite and hence destructible. The fact that sense particulars never hold kata tauta requires that they possess internal structural complexity, which in turn makes it highly unlikely that they are composite. On the other hand, because forms lack internal structural complexity, whatever features forms have, they possess kata tauta, that is, in relation to themselves. One might raise a question as to why Socrates uses the plural, kata tauta, to refer to the form's relation to their own internal structures, when the forms are also described as monoides, one in form. David proposes that Socrates is using kata tauta plural as shorthand for kata, the same thing singular, or things plural. I have one question about David's fascinating treatment of kata tauta eche. According to David, if x is f kata y, then y specifies some structural feature of x which determines the manner in which x is y. In which x is f. I can see how this works for sense particulars and perhaps even for the soul, since it is relatively clear what it means for them to have structural features. But I'm not sure what it means for a form to be kata, the same things. If Socrates isn't being sloppy with the plural, tauta, then we have a preliminary problem, since this would mean that the y in x is f kata y statement refers to plural internal structural features of the form, which would conflict with the forms being monoides. But even if we grant David that kata tauta is shorthand for kata, the same thing, singular, or things, we still have a difficulty. David plausibly interprets the forms being monoides as it's having no internal parts. But I am unclear on what it even means for something which lacks parts to possess an internal structure. And if the form lacks an internal structure, then I don't see how we can interpret its always being the same kata tauta as it's always being the same in relation to some internal structural feature of itself. A related and fascinating topic in David's book is his discussion of the class of the unseen. Recall that in the defense, when Socrates first introduces the forms, he distinguishes them from particulars in terms of forms being perceptible, particulars imperceptible. David claims that perceptibility is not, in fact, a fundamental difference between forms and ordinary objects. As part of his unfolding account, Socrates is simply appealing to a readily accessible difference between the two classes. In the kinship argument, Socrates introduces his account of what it is for the forms to hold kata tauta. It is this feature, and not their being unseen, which serves at a fundamental level to distinguish forms from ordinary objects. Granted, Socrates introduces two classes of things in the kinship argument, the class of the unseen and the class of the visible. But according to David, the unseen is simply the name of the group. It is not a group whose members include whatever is unseen. And indeed, being unseen is not a foundational feature of members of the class of the unseen. What distinguishes members of this group is, instead, their being unchanging, uniform, and always kata tauta. I find this claim that being unseen is not a foundational feature of the class of the unseen somewhat implausible. So I would like David to speak more about what hinges on this claim for him. It seems to me that there is one substantial piece of evidence that weighs against David's interpretation. If Socrates does not think that being unseen is a particularly important feature of members of the unseen, then why does he introduce a class of things that he names the unseen? David introduces several pieces of evidence in favor of his position. One that strikes me as quite interesting is that forms being unseen is a feature that they possess in relation to us, whereas their being kata tauta is a feature that they possess independently of us. However, it is interesting that at Timaeus 27d to 28a, when Plato opposes what is to what becomes, the first thing he tells us about each class is that the former is intelligible while the latter is perceptible. Plato alludes to the fact that forms are imperceptible, particulars perceptible, fairly often throughout his corpus, suggesting that this is a very important grounds for opposition for him. Plato provides another argument for his claim, which I find less persuasive. He notes that when Socrates summarizes the features of the unseen at 80b as divine, immortal, intelligible, uniform, and incapable of being disintegrated, he does not include the feature being unseen. But given that Socrates is describing the features of a class that is named the unseen, it might have seemed redundant to include in the list of features that the members of the unseen are themselves unseen. Finally, David points to the fact that Socrates describes the soul as more akin to the unseen and the body as more akin to the visible. If being visible is a sufficient condition for being a member of the class of the visible, and if the body is visible, then why does Socrates only claim that the body is more akin to the visible? But this claim occurs in a contrastive context. Socrates wants to know whether the body is more akin to the class of the visible or to the class of the unseen. This does not preclude the possibility that the body is more akin to the visible precisely because it is a member of the visible. Furthermore, even if visibility is not a sufficient condition for membership in the class of the visible, it seems likely that it is a necessary condition and thus not obvious why it fails to count as a foundational feature. One reason that David is interested to claim that being invisible is not a sufficient condition for being a member of the class of the unseen is because he wants to argue that the soul is not, in fact, a member of the class of the unseen, despite the fact that most souls are invisible. In this, David stands in opposition to many interpreters who take the kinship argument to seek to prove that the soul is indestructible by demonstrating that it is a member of the unseen. However, David astutely observes, first, that Socrates does not in fact claim that the soul is a member of the class of the unseen, only that it is akin to, syngenes, the unseen. David goes on to argue that the soul is akin to the unseen in virtue of its being itself unseen, it's becoming like the unseen when it investigates through itself, and its being by nature such as to rule over the body. But David points out most souls fail fully to express these three features. Contaminated souls acquire a corporeal accretion, which renders them visible. Many souls do not investigate through themselves, but rather through their senses, and most souls are enslaved to their bodies and thus fail to rule over them. Certain scholars, myself included, take this as evidence that the kinship argument does not in fact demonstrate that all souls are akin to the unseen and hence immortal, but only the soul of the philosopher. David argues that this conclusion is unwarranted. He maintains that all souls are akin to the unseen, even though they are not members of the class of the unseen, in the virtue of the fact that they have the capacity to purify themselves of the body, etc., whether or not they actualize this capacity. David interprets 84b in light of this assumption. There, Socrates concludes that, nourished by his vision of the unseen, the philosopher will not fear that his soul will dissipate at death. One might take this to imply that the philosopher will not fear that his philosophical soul will dissipate at death, since it has been properly nourished. David instead takes Socrates to claim that the philosopher will not fear death because he will recognize that all souls are indestructible in virtue of their broad kinship with the unseen. I'm sure it will come as no surprise to David that I do not agree with him on this issue. I am in full agreement with David's observation that most souls fail to actualize their capacity to be like the class of the unseen. They fail to purify themselves of and rule over their bodies, etc. But this could be indicative of two different things: that actualizing the soul's capacity to be like the unseen is not in fact necessary for it to be akin to the unseen, or that one's soul must purify itself in order to become fully akin to the unseen. I favor the second interpretation on both philosophical and textual grounds. First, once we grant that the soul is capable of devoting itself to the body, and hence of assimilating to the visible as well as to the unseen, then if, following David, we take the mere fact that the soul is capable of assimilating to the class of the unseen as evidence of its being akin to the class of the unseen, it seems that, by the very same reasoning, the fact that the soul is capable of assimilating to the class of the visible would indicate that it is also akin to the class of the visible. But in that case, we would have no more reason to think of any soul, philosophical or non-philosophical, that it is immortal rather than mortal. Furthermore, at the conclusion of the affinity argument, Socrates states, quote, "As for the soul, his unseen part, which gets away into a different place of this same kind, one which is noble, pure, and unseen, Hades as it truly is, when the soul, which we have found to be naturally of this kind, is separated from the body, does it immediately get scattered to the winds and perish, as ordinary people say? Far from it." Socrates' conclusion that the soul is unlikely to be scattered at death only applies to the soul which is the same in kind as Hades, unseen, noble, and pure, and it does not obviously apply to all souls. Again, at 84a7 to b2, Socrates claims that the philosopher's soul, nourished by his contemplation of what is true and divine and knowable, will believe that at death it will arrive at what is akin. Unlike 84b3 to 7, here it is not possible to take Socrates to be claiming that all souls are imperishable, since his claim is that the soul will exist with the forms and only the philosopher's soul will exist with the forms. But this strongly implies that in the passage immediately following, at 84b3 to 7, Socrates is making a parallel claim, that the philosopher does not fear death because he recognizes that his soul's nourishment on the forms ensures its imperishability. In sum, the evidence suggests that the kinship argument demonstrates that the philosopher's soul is imperishable, but not the more general conclusion that all soul is. The return to the defense makes a series of perplexing claims concerning the way in which the body adversely affects the soul. It claims that while we are alive, the body makes the soul impure and causes it to believe that only the somatoi des, which David translates as body-like, is real. At death, such a soul departs interspersed with a body-like element, which causes it to re-enter embodiment. What is this body-like element? David notes that the term somatoi des is a neologism and proposes that Socrates' only real commitment is that there is something or other interspersed with the soul that is in some way like the body, but that he may not be clear on what exactly this body-like element is. David then suggests that, given that the body's nature is connected to its attempt to rule and to its role in sense perception, the soul's being interspersed with the body-like element may simply consist in the soul's allowing the body to rule and to guide it in belief formation. But I worry that while this may be an account of what it is for the soul to become body-like, this does not tell us much about what makes the body-like element body-like, nor about how the body-like element causes the soul to rely on sense perception. Perhaps David means to claim that the body-like element simply is the soul's disposition to allow the body to rule, etc., but that certainly is not what the text suggests, nor would it give a robust account of the soul's impurity. How does the body-like element draw the soul to embodiment on David's account? David proposes that the body-like element implants a desire for the body-like in the soul through a like is attracted to like principle. Since the soul is interspersed with the body-like, it desires more of the body-like and hence is drawn to re-embodiment. It's worth noting that 81D to E can be read two different ways. First, as claiming that the body-like element draws the soul to re-embodiment through its desire, that is, a desire belonging to the body-like element, or second, that it is the soul's desire for the body-like element that draws it to re-embodiment. David takes the text in the second sense because he wishes to deny that the body can be the subject of mental states. But if we take the desire to belong to the soul and to be directed at the body-like element, then his like is attracted to like principle becomes more difficult to apply. For the soul is not simply body-like, it is interspersed with the body-like. Thus, on the like is attracted to like principle, the soul ought to be attracted to souls interspersed with body-like elements and not simply to more of the body-like. What about the problems caused by the body? At 83C, Socrates states that, quote, the soul of every human being, when it experiences intense pleasure or pain at something, is forced to believe at that moment that whatever particularly gives rise to that feeling is most clear and most real when it isn't so. These are above all visible things, end quote. David observes that believing the cake is real is unlikely to change one's behavior. You must believe that the cake is good and worth enjoying. How does the body effect this change in evaluative beliefs? The body causes us to eat the cake, and the pleasure of eating the cake causes us to believe that the cake is good. But in fact, that is not what the passage claims. It states that the body causes us to believe that the visible is real, not that it is good. Thus, I believe that there remains an unsolved interpretive question as to how exactly the body affects the soul's ontological beliefs. The final topic I'd like to address is whether or not in the Phaedo the body is the subject of mental states. David argues that while the body causes the soul to have pleasures, appetites, and so forth, it is always the soul which is the subject of these mental states. According to David, the only passage which clearly states that the body is the subject of mental states is 83D. Here, Socrates describes the damage the soul suffers due to the body. Quote, each pleasure and pain nails it to the body as if with a nail and pins it and makes it body-like, since it believes to be true the very things that the body says are true. For from its having the same beliefs as the body and enjoying the same things, it is forced, I think, to come to have the same way of life and the same nourishment. David claims that talk of the body being pinned or nailed to the soul is clearly metaphorical, and that this legitimates taking the claims that the body says certain things are true and that the soul has the same beliefs as the body to be metaphorical as well. He notes that we often speak of our bodies telling us things without meaning this literally. However, it is worth noting that Socrates doesn't just say that the body speaks to the soul, but also that they have the same beliefs. And we don't often say, my mind shares beliefs with my body, as shorthand for, my body is causing my mind to have certain beliefs. More broadly, Socrates seems to be suggesting a very specific way in which the body causes the soul to change its ontological beliefs. The body takes something to be true, and then tells the soul this thing is true, causing the soul to form the same belief. On David's interpretation, the body does not believe anything to be real, but still shapes the soul's ontological beliefs. It would be helpful to know more about how he thinks the body brings this about. The other prime evidence for taking the body to be the subject of mental states lies in Socrates' response to the harmonia argument. Here, Socrates writes of how the soul masters the body by opposing its alleged components, quote, threatening some and admonishing others, conversing with appetites and passions and fears like one thing with another, end quote. On the face of it, to claim that the soul opposes the body by admonishing and conversing with appetites, passions, and fears, like one thing with another, seems to suggest that the body is partially constituted by or the subject of these mental states. David notes that Socrates does not attribute these mental states to the body, only stating that they are inside us. Thus, he takes Socrates to claim that the soul opposes the body by opposing the appetites and passions that the body gives rise to in the soul. David is correct that Socrates does not specify what exactly is the subject of these mental states. However, granting that they are in the human, given that the human is composed of body and soul, this leaves us with two options. Either the body is the subject of these mental states, or the soul is. Given that David does not wish to grant that the body is their subject, he must hold that the soul is. But this gives rise to two difficulties. If the soul is the subject of the very mental states that it is opposing, then how does it speak to them as one thing to another? And if the soul is the subject of these mental states, then it appears that in opposing them, it opposes itself. What we would have evidence for would be psychic partitioning, not the claim that the soul rules the body by opposing it. I could go on and on. David's book is so philosophically rich that it gives rise to endless questions and counter-arguments. But it's now time for me to turn the discussion over to David. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for these rich comments. So I shall now let David reply first, and then we can open the floor to question and discussions.
Well, thank you both so much for this very rich set of comments that I really am going to give a lot of thought to. I also want to make sure that there's time for broader discussion. And so I will try to be brief in replying, but I will definitely be spending a while digesting your comments. So I suppose one of the things that I find interesting, exciting about the Phaedo is thinking that we get a notion of an ordinary physical object from thinking of it in contrast to something. Forms, the soul, the body, something like that. And that Plato is at the beginning of theories of how exactly to draw that contrast. So Federico asked, is he thinking of ordinary things using a bundle theory? Is it hylomorphism? And I mostly want to try to say, I don't see a clear commitment on his part to one of these over another. Instead, he's precisely at the beginning of trying to articulate what the contrast class is to the forms. And so the three features that I think we get is that ordinary things change over time. Ordinary things are sometimes have one feature in relation to one thing, another feature in relation to something else. And ordinary things have this structural complexity. And all three of those things lead to them having a receptivity to opposites. And this receptivity to opposites is something that Socrates discusses at the beginning of the final argument. And so why to turn to something that Suzanne was asking, why do I think that being visible isn't one of the fundamental features of ordinary objects and being invisible one of the fundamental features of forms? It seems to me that he's systematically interconnecting these different types of compresence of opposites and connecting it to ordinary objects having a receptivity to receiving opposites, whether those opposites are over time or in relation to things or in virtue of their complex parts, whereas forms precisely don't have such a receptivity. And I don't see the visible, invisible sort of systematically fitting in. Now, clearly, one thing that I'm trying to do in the book is to push back against the fact that we just take over from Aristotle, the idea that the one group of things are the sensible things and the others are the forms. And so Aristotle is sort of like given us a terminology, which is not a terminology that we get in the Phaedo. And so I'm trying to sort of avoid that and ask, how important really is this being perceptible as a feature of the contrast class for the forms? Maybe I'll also say something about how I'm thinking of the explanatory power of the forms and have that sort of finish off my response to Federico. So the general view that I want to articulate is that what's aitios or aition is the thing which is responsible, which is something like that person is responsible for her death. But it's not yet an explanation of how he did it. And the idea is supposed to be a fuller explanation of how the person who's aitios did the things that made them aitios in the first place. And so the sort of key bit of evidence for this is that we identify nous as aitios, but the question still remains what the idea is. So we know who's responsible, nous, but what is the idea? Well, that would require a much larger explanation that requires knowing what's best. And so you can know who's responsible without knowing how they were responsible. That requires further investigation. When applied to the forms, the thought is the form of largeness is what's responsible, but it's having a share in the form of largeness that's what makes me larger than the chair that's right next to me. Now, these cases, so what's supposed to be explanatory here is that just pointing to the form of largeness only gets you so far, but knowing that I have a share of largeness. Now, what exactly does that share amount to? These things, I think you can sort of fill out the explanation further. So it's not that that needs to be sort of the final, as informative as possible, right? So that you can make a more informed account, but it gives you the basics of why I'm larger than that person. Well, because I have a share of largeness. Now, this is complicated because he emphasizes that this is a sort of ignorant answer and that it's simple. And so I think it's supposed to be a kind of minimal explanation. Okay, I mean, I can go on, and I'm very happy to keep discussing in discussion. But I should say a little bit more in relation to Suzanne's set of comments. So I don't know that I had the right terminology for this. I don't know that the right terminology exists. I might also just have very much the wrong ideas. What I want to suggest is that the use of kata is used to pick out either an entire thing, which is a sort of limit case of a structural feature, like the structure is the whole, or something that's connected to the structure in terms of its parts. And so what's going on with a form which is auto kath auto? Well, it's itself kata itself, and it doesn't have any structure, and so it's just the whole thing. But the same is true also when our souls are auto kath auto. It's our entire soul, even if that soul has some structure. In a sense, that's irrelevant. It's in virtue of the entire soul that the soul is investigating, say, to use an example that he uses. And so whether the thing has structure or not, so when I talk about internal structure, I suppose non-external would be because the whole isn't internal to itself. So that's maybe just a little bit of, but hopefully it clarifies the idea. And so then the thought is that he thinks that our soul gets some sort of impurities in it, and that means that there can be features that are kata, some things which are inside the soul. And so it is in virtue of things, but things which aren't proper and properly belonging to the soul, but are foreign to the soul, shouldn't be there. And so the connection between purity and auto kath auto is that when these other features are there, they stop the thing from being able to do its activities just in terms of its entire self because of these impurities which are in it. So so that's the sort of basic thought about the connection between purity and autokathauto, what I meant by internal structure. The stuff about the somoides, the body-like, is again, here we have the very first use of this word that's going to end up being very important, of corporeal. But what exactly does it mean to describe the soul as corporeal? And the view that I'm sort of flirting with, I guess I think of myself as maybe being a little bit less decisive than Suzanne was suggesting in a few places. You know, I suggest that maybe we can take a fairly minimal reading of what it means for the soul to be corporeal, where it means there is some element in the soul, and whatever it is that that element is, it's leading to this sort of behavior, but it's not making a commitment as to what it is. Similarly, I try to argue that we can take the Phaedo as being committed to the body not having mental states, and that we can understand the whole dialogue without that. And maybe he is committed to it, but he doesn't need it because we can read it without that. And so even if it is what he meant, it doesn't play a crucial role in the structure of the arguments. Okay, so I should really stop. And so I stop.
Thank you, David. I don't know if the two discussants want to reply again, or if there are other questions also.
I think we should open, I mean, not to the offense of the two discussants, but I think we should open the floor. And I know that a number of people have started actually reading the book, which I'm still a little surprised by. So I'm happy to field questions on any topic, or pick up something that the discussants mentioned that I didn't address that you really wanted to know my answer to. I'll take anything.
I guess, hi, David. I guess I should say that somehow I'm Gail Justin. Somehow my husband's name got attached to my picture. So at any rate, I wanted to ask something about the cyclical argument since I've been working on that.
Sorry, I ran out of paper, but I have returned. Okay.
Okay. I guess I'm really curious about what exactly, I'm asking really about the cyclical argument. What exactly is your view between, on the relationship between the living person who comes alive again and the soul that comes to life? Because if you look at 70C 8 through 9, I think it is 8 through 9, where Socrates says, let's see, if this holds that, if this holds in this way, that the living and its two zontos, so that's definitely persons, come alive from the dead, then is anything else the case that our souls would have to be there? So there's really a clear distinction, be there in Hades. There's really a clear distinction between living persons and souls. And I really didn't get clear from your discussion how you work out that distinction.
So, okay, so I'm not sure that I have so let me say some things and then let me see if this is starting to address. So I take it that living people, humans, are composed of body and soul, and their bodies don't exist in Hades after death. Their bodies are cremated or in the ground somewhere, or so Now, my general analysis of this argument, as you know, but others here might not, is that at the beginning of the argument, Socrates gets them to agree to this conditional, that if I can show that the living come from the dead, then we will take that as an agreement that souls continue to exist after Hades, and then the word soul doesn't reappear in the rest of the argument until he draws the conclusion. So he sort of sets this agreement at the beginning of the argument. If I can show this about living and dead, we'll take that as sufficient to show this about the soul. And that Cabes happily agrees to this claim, and that means that he doesn't have to give a sort of more detailed account of what the relationship is between the soul and the living person. In some ways, I think you could see the final argument as, of course, further specifying that, I mean, there he says that the body is alive in virtue, well, complicated sentence. The body is alive, the soul is in the body, and it's because the soul is in the body that the body is alive. And so we can also think that the person as a whole is alive. The soul is that in virtue of which bodies and entire people are alive. But I don't think that here in the cyclical argument, he's meaning to address any of that. He just gets Cabes to agree to this so that he can focus on what's going to be, as it were, the prime point of contention. Does that answer the question?
Well, that sort of strikes me as that you have not really dealt with the problem, because for one thing, Socrates explains the inference. He says, well, let's see now if he says that it couldn't come again if the soul didn't exist. And that's a gar clause, and that's explaining the inference. So obviously the soul has some capacity, or that's not quite the right word, but the soul is causally effective here in having the living person come again, or having a person come again. And so I think that you really have sort of made it too easy for yourself. And I'm not quite sure why you would go to a way that Aristotle has of using a syllogism to explain what Plato is doing. So
I mean, I didn't mean to be using Aristotle to explain what he's doing, but so because they could hardly be born again if they didn't exist, do you think that the people are being born again? It's normally thought that that the soul is reborn. The soul can only be reborn if the soul exists beforehand. So I guess I don't see anything in that sentence that tells us anything about the relationship between the soul and the entire persons being alive, how the soul might help to explain life. In any event, that's an idea that's certainly much more elaborated in the final argument. But okay, so we have this one gar clause. It's still the case that the discussion doesn't go into this at all. I mean, so we have one gar clause, and then the rest of the entire argument is about whether the living come to be from the dead, just as the dead come to be from the living, and he has a couple of different arguments for this, in sharp contrast to the following arguments, which tell us much more about the soul. So possibly, I mean, I'm skeptical that this one sentence is really going to tell you much about the soul, but at most you have one sentence that's doing it. And so for sort of my larger picture, it seems to me that this is something where we're not getting much, if anything, about the soul.
Okay, well, thank you.
Sure.
So William Strigel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'll lower my hand here. Hi, David. Greetings. Nice to meet
Hey,
you.
good to see you.
I followed you on social media, but I don't think we've met or anything. I just have a very softball question for you. So no heady, logical problems here. I just wanted to take or pick your mind on the reason for why Plato is said to not be present at the discussion. So they say, of course, he's sick, right? Or he was too weak to show up, I think is what the Greek says. He wasn't just sick, right? Like, which is either just a ridiculous fiction or true, I suppose, right? Or it's a meaningful fiction. And, the Glenn Most, right, has that article, which says that it's a deeply meaningful fiction, because the closing of the dialogue with the Coctus Clepius and all of that refers to Plato, right, as being healed. With all due respect to Glenn Most, I respect him a lot. I've never really been, sold by that argument of his. And so I was wondering, because I was wondering if you could tell me what your thoughts are on that passage, because I also have a kind of, the Phaedo is just a glorious whole, like your book, tries to show, right, of course, but, and I would just like to think that if I could, this is my thought, and I want to bounce it off of you and hear what you have to say, just in general. But could it be the case that, Plato is sick precisely because the role of the philosopher is to do nothing other than practice the art of dying? In other words, it's kind of like an inside joke, right? Like Plato is off doing philosophy, as it were. He is the ideal philosopher precisely because, he comes off as like sick and weakly, as you might find in comedy, for example, which is in fact referenced in that section where he talks about it or introduces that ideal. Anyway, sorry, I've talked enough. I just want to pick your brain, what you think about on that passage.
So I'll briefly say my thoughts on this, and then a quick response on that idea. So obviously one possibility is that he felt compelled by historical reality, and then we can't read anything out of it. Assuming that that's not the case, one feature that we see, Plato never makes himself a character in his own dialogues. So if he had been, it's a collection of Socrates' closest companions. If he had been present, he either would have talked or he wouldn't have talked. If he hadn't talked, that's quite a portrayal of Plato. Somebody who, on the last day of Socrates' life, said absolutely not a word. Whew, okay. Or he talks, but it doesn't look like Plato wants to make himself a speaker in his dialogues. So it looks to me like he has a reason to write himself out of, and so my tendency is to not want to read much more into it than that. Then there's the way in which the body is said to hinder us from doing philosophy. And so I would be more inclined, and I think this is sort of the opposite of what you were suggesting, I would be more inclined to think he would have viewed this as an incredible philosophical opportunity. So it's not that doing philosophy would mean not being there on the last day of Socrates' life. This is a person who lives and breathes philosophy. He's not able to go and contemplate the forms at this moment. And so he can go and spend the last day with his master. So instead choosing the fact that he's weak or he's ill gives an explanation that fits with the idea that we get later, that the body is constantly hindering us from being able to pursue wisdom. So
right, there's an article, I think, by who talks about Plato on the body and mentions that very sort of reading. Goodness, I can't remember. But yeah, okay, that's fair enough. I buy that. Thank
I
you.
mean, Gabor Beteg has a paper on Plato on illness where he discusses this, but there are plenty of others as well.
Right. Thanks so very much. I appreciate
You're
it.
very welcome.
So, Lisk,
I
Hi,
can't
sorry,
hear you. Okay,
you hear
now
me?
I can. Yeah.
First, I apologize. I got the time difference wrong, so I'm late arriving, but nonetheless, I still wanted to ask you a question, if that's okay. I wanted to ask about 77E and the comments about, you know, the monster, you know, the child within us is always going to be frightened of the fear of death. That just nothing happens, you know, once we're dead. There's nothing that lives on. Socrates seems to say there that, you know, we have to go on sort of singing our spells as if that's what argument amounts to, just almost like a performance. How significant do you think that is? I mean, the reason I ask this is that I'm very struck by how, or one of the reasons I ask this, I'm very struck by how some, you know, prominent readers, Gadamer and Jacob Klein and others, comment on how poor the four arguments are, and that maybe that's not really the full point of the dialogue. You know, that maybe it's more about, you know, countering mythology and going on doing the performance of philosophy. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, if that's okay.
Absolutely. So it's people across almost every tradition who seem to think that this argument is a particularly bad argument. And so absolutely you have Gadamer and Klein, but you also have anyway, but people of, you know, on the analytic side across the board thinking that these are bad arguments. And so I'm inclined to not read it that way. In the Charmides, we have the idea that the philosopher is going to provide a sort of charm, or sorry, that Socrates is going to provide a sort of charm to help Charmides out of this, and that charm turns out to be nothing other than the philosophical discussion that ensues. Socrates seems to suggest that they should devote themselves entirely to finding someone who can perform such a charm, searching everywhere. Across the whole Phaedo, there's this idea that they should be devoting themselves entirely to philosophy. So if they're going, you know, to other cities, to other lands, to seek out this. So I think we're getting the idea that philosophy is the true charm that will allow you to overcome your fear of death. I mean, this is sort of the view that I try to elaborate, and it's part of a complex account that I give of trying to show that this argument is actually a much better argument than people have taken it to be. And so sort of already from the very beginning, before the argument even starts, people think it must be a bad argument because it's supposed to be this, oh, he's just giving them a charm. I think we're seeing Socrates playfully pick up on the language that his interlocutor is using, but throughout the whole dialogue where, you know, the true initiate is the philosopher, the person who truly, so this idea that the true version of X is really the philosopher, I think we're getting that the person who can truly offer an enchantment that'll really make your fear go away is a philosopher. And so I don't take that as evidence for its non-philosophical nature. Of course, that's just one chink in the overall argument. There's one other thing that I wanted to say on this, and that's that I do think that this is picking up directly on Kebby's challenge, which comes at right around 70A, where people normally take that as Kebby says, but you still haven't shown that the soul is immortal. But that's not what Kebby says. What Kebby says is people have this fear that the soul is going to be dissipated upon death. And so I'm looking for some sort of confidence to think that the soul will continue to exist after death and that it'll be unified. And so the way I wanted to read this is that Socrates thinks, look, I've offered the recollecting argument, and that should be enough to convince you. But it seems that the fear continues to remain. And what you asked me to do was to remove this fear of death. And the correct way to remove the fear of death is through philosophy. And so let me give you another argument.
Thanks very much. That's really interesting. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
So Herman.
Hello, yeah, thank you very much. My question relates to one of the points raised by Suzanne Obdrzalek. And it's this question whether the soul belongs to the class of the unseen, or what exactly kinship means. I think I would be inclined to agree with you that it's not a member of the class itself, but that it's this kinship. I mean, interestingly, although he explicitly distinguishes two classes of being, the soul seems to be a third kind of thing that's sort of on the horizon, so to speak, and can interact with either of them. So what my thought on why the soul could be, or how he characterizes this kinship doesn't feature in your list of features that make the soul akin. So I was just interested in what you think about this, because Suzanne in her comments said it has the capacity to interact with both, and so the capacity itself doesn't seem to be what renders it akin, but clearly the argument itself describes two very different conditions that the soul is in when it interacts with both, and when it interacts with the forms, it seems to be in this state of almost cognitive health or virtue. It's not dizzy, it's not confused. And then similarly, if we take on what happens later, moreover, it's not only cognitively not deficient anymore, but it also becomes morally virtuous and good as a whole. So wouldn't it be one route of showing the kinship of the soul with the forms to say that when it is with the forms, it is in its proper order, it's virtuous and good, and that this is first and foremost the way in which this kinship manifests itself beyond the list of features that which you discuss in your book.
Good. So this is an idea that I consider, and I ultimately don't accept it, although I might be wrong in not accepting it. So first of all, let me say a few things to sort of set things up. So yes, I mean, one of the key things for me is the idea that the unseen is always holds kata the same things. So this always there, where it seems that the soul is very clear that it's not always the case that the soul holds kata the same things. So that seems to me to just be clear evidence that it can't be a member of the unseen. So that's, that doesn't touch on all of these issues, but they're sort of like, okay, it's not a member of the unseen. Now, I think that the body is he says that the body is akin to the visible. And so if I understood your suggestion, it was the fact that the soul, when it spends its time with what it's akin to, is in a better state, is a sign that that's what it's akin to. And I think if that were right, then when the body spent more time with the visible, it would be in a better state. But actually, it looks like the body is in better shape when it lets the soul rule over it and lets the soul stay healthy. And so it's not always the case that we are in a better state when we spend time with what we're akin to. Instead, I think we are extremely lucky, according to Plato. We are akin to the divine forms. Our souls are. And this means that we're naturally drawn to things that will put us in a virtuous and good state. Thank goodness we're not akin to the visible things. Then we would be natural, then our soul would be drawn to these things that would put us in a bad condition. So the question is whether going to what you're akin to sort of always puts you in a better condition. And I think in the case of the body, it doesn't. And so I don't want that as a sort of general rule that when we spend time with what we're akin to. So now let me say something in response to your initial question. How am I thinking about kinship? I would say, you know, to be rough about it, two basic features. One, I do think that it's supposed to be something like you broadly share a genus with the thing, you're broadly related to it, your kin are people who you are related to. And so I think we're supposed to have we're supposed to be broadly related, or our souls are supposed to be broadly related to the forms. And that broad relation is precisely what allows us to grasp the forms. We need to have something in common with them in order to make intellectual contact with them. One point. Second point, I think that it's not just that we're broadly related to them, but that we are drawn to them. So this is a principle that we get explicit in the Timaeus. Hot things are drawn to other hot things because of their kinship. We also get it in Republic 10, that our soul is drawn to what is, and it has this horme to be with what is because of its kinship. So in Timaeus and Republic, we get more explicit that kinship, it's not just, because I mean, I share a genus with monkeys, but I'm not drawn to monkeys. So simply sharing a genus with something doesn't automatically draw you to it. So I think kinship sort of involves two things, this broadly sharing a nature, but broadly sharing a nature of a sort that draws you to it. And so the way I want to understand the investigating passage is, if we leave the soul alone and we remove all of this garbage from the soul, what does it do? It goes to the forms, and that's a sign of its kinship to the forms, because things that are akin are drawn to one another. So anyway, there's.
Yeah, thank you. I hadn't considered of course, what it meant if the body is said to be syngenes with the visible. I suppose what I had thought about was certain passages where Plato comments on what is oikeon to us, and there he seems to suggest that that which is truly good for us is oikeon. So in that sense, we might say the soul is oikeon to the forms, because in that state it becomes virtuous. But then even if that is true, then we still have the question of whether the same shouldn't also hold for the body.
Yes, and what I mean, the body needs ruling over by us to be in its best condition. Yeah, in any event, I'm very fascinated by this notion of kinship across Plato. I think it's much more important than people have tended to make it, and I certainly don't feel like I'm at the bottom of understanding how he thinks about it. So connections to oikeon is quite interesting, and not an avenue that I've thought through myself.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, I shall thank again our speakers, David, Federico, and Suzanne. Thank you very much for this rich discussion. And I don't know if Julia or Federico wants to add something, some conclusive remarks, or.
Well, Federico, you can go add the conclusive remark.
Very quickly. I'm thanking, of course, again, David and Suzanne for taking part in this last session of this year. Well, we have explored in these 4 sessions Plato, but also the Stoics and Plotinus. We had a huge range of topics and volumes, and a constant feature of these meetings is that we expected to have, 75 minutes, but we usually went far beyond the time we planned, and it is very nice just because this shows that there is dialogue and debate. So if the core of the organization and all good things of these events are due to Julia and Arianna, and so
thank you very much.
I am thanking them warmly, and hopefully see you next year with another series of the shells.